He believed he had won. He believed that after 22 years of marriage, he could stand on my own porch, hand me a folder of papers, and walk away without consequence. He believed his mother had planned everything so carefully that nothing could stop them. What he did not know was that the smile on my face was not the smile of a woman who had given up. It was the smile of a woman who already knew something he did not. Within 4 days, the man who tried to make me homeless would be the one begging for a place to sleep. Stay with me until the end, because you will not believe what happened next. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I am 47 years old. For most of my adult life, I believed I had built something solid. My husband Daniel and I had been married for 22 years. We were not a perfect couple, but we were a steady one. We owned a comfortable colonial-style home in a quiet Ohio suburb. We raised 2 children together, and we spent countless evenings on that porch, talking about the years ahead of us. At least, that is what I believed for a very long time. The trouble did not begin with Daniel. It began with his mother, Eleanor. From the very first dinner she hosted after our engagement, Eleanor made it clear that she did not consider me good enough for her son. She had a way of asking questions that sounded innocent on the surface but carried a small blade underneath. She would ask whether I had ever considered a different career, or whether I truly understood how to run a proper household the way she had taught Daniel to expect. Every holiday became a quiet battlefield disguised as a family gathering. Every birthday, every anniversary, every family photograph became an opportunity for her to remind me that I was, in her words, simply a guest in the family rather than a true member of it. Daniel always excused her behavior. He would tell me that his mother only wanted the best for him and that I was reading too much into small comments that meant nothing. Sometimes, late at night, I would try to explain how those comments accumulated over the years, how a single sharp remark repeated at every dinner for 2 decades eventually becomes something heavier than any single moment could ever be. He would nod along, promise to speak with her, and then nothing would change. For years, I accepted this pattern because I loved him and because peace felt more valuable than being right. Something shifted during the final 2 years of our marriage. Daniel grew distant in ways I could not fully explain. He began taking phone calls in the garage with the door closed, lowering his voice whenever I walked past. Bank statements that used to arrive openly on the kitchen counter started disappearing before I could look at them closely. When I asked simple questions about our finances, he answered with irritation instead of honesty, telling me I worried too much about details that were, according to him, already handled. Weekend trips to visit Eleanor became more frequent, and I was rarely invited along anymore. For the first time since our wedding day, I felt like a visitor inside the home I had spent 2 decades building with my own hands. One afternoon in early spring, I had been at the office of my late aunt's estate attorney, finalizing paperwork related to a property she had left me the year before. The meeting ran long, but it ended well, and I remember feeling lighter than I had in months as I drove home along the familiar tree-lined streets of our neighborhood. All I wanted that evening was a quiet dinner and an early night. Instead, when I pulled into the driveway, I saw Daniel and Eleanor standing together on the front porch, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. Their posture, their silence, the way Eleanor held a folder against her chest like a trophy, all of it told me this was not a casual visit. Daniel's face was tight and unreadable. Eleanor, on the other hand, looked as though she were barely containing her excitement. "Claire," Daniel said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "We need to talk." Before I could respond, Eleanor stepped forward and placed a thick manila envelope directly into my hands, her fingers lingering just a moment too long, as if she wanted to savor the handoff. I opened it slowly, and my chest tightened as I recognized the paperwork inside. Divorce documents, already partially filled out, already dated for signature, already prepared with a precision that told me this had been planned for weeks, perhaps months. I looked up at Daniel, searching his face for some explanation, but he only looked away toward the driveway, unable to meet my eyes. Eleanor did not wait for silence to settle. "There is more," she announced, her voice practically glowing with satisfaction. "The house has already been listed and sold. You will need to vacate by the end of the week." She said it the way someone announces good news, as though she expected me to be impressed by how efficiently they had orchestrated my removal from my own life. For a long moment, I said nothing. 22 years, 2 children now grown and living their own lives, countless sacrifices made quietly and without complaint. And this was how it would end, on a porch, with an envelope and an eviction notice disguised as a family conversation. Daniel finally spoke again, and his words confirmed everything I feared. "I have spent my whole life caught between you and my mother," he said quietly, staring at his shoes. "I am tired of choosing." Eleanor beamed beside him, clearly proud of her long campaign finally reaching its conclusion after so many years of patient maneuvering. I expected to feel rage. I expected my hands to shake and my voice to break apart under the weight of it. Instead, a strange and steady calm settled over me. The kind of calm that arrives only when a person finally understands the full shape of a situation. I looked down at the papers again, then back up at the two of them standing shoulder to shoulder like conspirators who had just pulled off the perfect plan. "So," I said, my voice even and unhurried, "the sale has already gone through completely." Eleanor nodded with obvious pride, clearly delighted that I seemed to be absorbing the reality of my situation. "Every detail has been handled," she confirmed. I could not stop the smile that spread across my face. Eleanor's expression shifted instantly from triumph to confusion. "What exactly is so amusing to you?" she asked, her tone sharpening into something almost accusatory. Daniel looked equally puzzled, glancing between his mother and me as though trying to understand a joke he had not been told. I folded the envelope closed and held it against my chest. "Tell me something," I said calmly, keeping my voice steady. "Who authorized this sale?" Eleanor laughed, waving her hand dismissively as though the question itself were beneath her. "My son did." "That is all that should matter to you." I nodded slowly, because that single sentence told me everything I needed to know. What neither Daniel nor Eleanor understood was a detail buried deep within paperwork they had never bothered to read carefully. 3 years earlier, after my aunt passed away, I inherited far more than a modest sum of money. Among the assets left to me was a family trust, one that held a legal ownership stake tied directly to the property Daniel and I called home. This arrangement predated our marriage by decades, established quietly by my aunt long before Daniel ever entered my life, back when the land was still surrounded by open fields rather than suburban streets. Daniel had known about the inheritance in a vague sense, but he had never paid attention to the specifics. Whenever legal correspondence arrived regarding the property, he passed it along to me without reading a single line, always trusting that I would manage the details he found tedious. Eleanor had made the same assumption for years, believing the house belonged entirely to her son simply because his name appeared prominently on the mortgage documents. What they failed to grasp was a simple and unshakable truth. Financing a property and owning a property are not the same thing, and no amount of confidence could change what the law actually recognized. I stepped away from them, pulled out my phone, and called my aunt's estate attorney directly, my voice steady despite everything happening around me. He answered within moments, and after I explained what had just happened, his response was immediate and precise. The sale, he confirmed, could not legally proceed, not without the trust's formal approval, not without signatures that had never been obtained, and certainly not without proper notification to every party holding a legitimate interest in the property. He told me to remain calm, to say nothing further to either of them, and to come into his office first thing the next morning. Within the hour, Daniel's phone began ringing. Then Eleanor's phone joined in, buzzing insistently from inside her handbag. The confident smiles that had greeted me on the porch only an hour earlier disappeared entirely, replaced by a rising panic neither of them could hide. Later that evening, my attorney called again with an update that made everything clear. "Claire," he said, "you should come in first thing tomorrow morning. We need to address this properly and quickly before things become more complicated than they already are." The following morning, I sat across from my attorney as he laid out the full scope of the situation with documents spread carefully across the conference table between us. Daniel and Eleanor had made a costly and serious error. The prospective buyers had already transferred a deposit and signed preliminary agreements, all based on information that was legally incomplete. Because the trust held partial ownership rights, neither Daniel nor Eleanor possessed the authority to finalize any transaction without my consent, regardless of how confidently they had proceeded. The consequences arrived quickly. The buyers demanded answers, understandably alarmed that a transaction they believed was finalized now stood on unstable legal ground. The real estate agency began asking uncomfortable questions of Daniel and Eleanor, questions neither of them had prepared answers for. Attorneys on multiple sides became involved within days, and what had once seemed like a simple, cruel plan quickly transformed into a tangled legal complication entirely of their own making. Daniel called me 7 times before noon. I let every call go unanswered, watching my phone light up again and again from across the kitchen table in the small rental apartment I had already begun arranging for myself. That afternoon, Eleanor left a series of increasingly frantic voicemails, each one blaming someone new for the unraveling situation. According to her, the real estate agent had been careless, the attorney handling the sale had been negligent, even Daniel somehow had failed to manage the details properly. Anyone but herself, of course, because admitting fault had never once appeared in Eleanor's playbook. Meanwhile, word of what had actually happened began spreading through the extended family. Relatives who had only ever heard Eleanor's version of events slowly began learning the truth from neighbors, from mutual friends, and eventually from me directly. Several of them reached out, apologizing for assumptions they had made over the years based on incomplete information Eleanor had carefully curated. For the first time in a very long while, people outside our immediate household were finally hearing both sides of the story, and the picture that emerged was very different from the one Eleanor had spent years painting. That evening, Daniel reached me from a number I did not recognize. "Claire, please," he said, his voice noticeably different from the cold tone he had used on the porch only a day earlier. "Can we talk?" Gone was the certainty from before. Gone was the confidence that had radiated from him and his mother side by side. For the first time in years, he sounded genuinely afraid, almost like the young man I had first fallen in love with before his mother's influence had hardened him into someone else. I stood by my window for a long moment before answering, my voice steady and unwavering. "Now you want to talk?" I said, and hung up without waiting for a response. We met 2 days later at a small diner on the edge of town, somewhere neutral, somewhere quiet enough that we could speak honestly without an audience. Daniel looked worn down, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, his posture smaller than I remembered it ever being throughout our entire marriage. The moment he sat across from me, the apologies began pouring out in a rush, as though he had rehearsed them the entire drive over. "Claire, I made a terrible mistake," he said. I listened without interrupting, letting him speak until the words ran dry on their own. He rubbed his hands together nervously and stared at the table between us, unable to hold my gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. "My mother kept insisting that you were holding me back, that leaving was the only way I would ever be truly happy. I believed her because I always believed her, for as long as I can remember. I thought about every year I had spent defending our marriage while he defended his mother instead of me, every holiday I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace, every quiet sacrifice that had gone unnoticed and unacknowledged. Now, faced with real consequences, he wanted understanding. He wanted forgiveness, handed to him freely, the way he had always received it from his mother, regardless of what he had done. "Daniel," I said softly, "you did not choose your mother once. You chose her again and again, for years, while I stood alone every single time, waiting for a version of you that put us first." His shoulders sank, and for the first time in our entire relationship, he did not argue with me. In the days that followed, Eleanor attempted one final act of manipulation, insisting to the family that I was the reason everything had fallen apart, that my refusal to cooperate was tearing everyone away from each other after all the years she had supposedly held the family together. But I was finished carrying the weight of decisions that were never mine to begin with, and finished absorbing blame for choices made entirely by other people. The divorce proceedings moved forward steadily over the following months. The financial settlement was handled fairly, guided entirely by law rather than emotion, and Daniel, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, accepted an outcome without turning to his mother for guidance. As I walked out of the courthouse for the final time, I felt something rise in my chest that I had not experienced in years. Freedom, real and complete, settling over me like sunlight after a long winter. 7 months later, the divorce was finalized entirely, every document signed, every account separated, every shared obligation dissolved. The property dispute had long since been resolved in accordance with the trust, exactly as my aunt's careful planning had ensured it would be. My inheritance remained fully protected, exactly as she had intended it to be decades before any of this had ever happened. For the first time in a very long time, my future belonged completely to me, without conditions, without approval required from anyone else. I moved into a smaller home, overlooking a quiet stretch of woods just outside the city, far enough from the old neighborhood that I no longer passed familiar streets that carried painful memories. It was not the largest house I had ever lived in, but it was mine, entirely and without condition, and that mattered more than square footage ever could. I planted a small garden along the back fence that first autumn, something I had always wanted to do but had never found the time for during my marriage. Daniel remained with his mother after everything settled, moving back into the house he had grown up in as though the years in between had simply folded away. From what family members later told me, the arguments between them only grew louder with time, echoing through that same house where Eleanor had once ruled every decision. The very voice he had spent his whole life obeying eventually became a voice he could no longer escape, no matter how many years had passed since he first learned to listen to it above all others. As for me, I built something new from the ground up, slowly and deliberately, the way a person rebuilds after a storm has passed. New friendships formed slowly and honestly, built on mutual respect rather than old family obligations. New routines gave my days a steady rhythm again. Morning walks along the tree line, quiet evenings with a book, weekend visits from my children who told me, more than once, how proud they were of the way I had handled everything. One evening, sitting on my new porch and watching the sun fall behind the trees in shades of orange and gold, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. The betrayal had cut deep. The dishonesty had left scars that took real time to heal. Longer than I expected. Longer than anyone around me seemed to understand. But losing people who never truly valued me in the first place was never a real loss at all. They tried to leave me with nothing, standing on that porch with their smug smiles and their carefully signed papers. Instead, they gave me everything I needed to finally begin again, on my own terms, in a life that was, at long last, entirely my own.